So here we are at that lovely first chapter, introducing Cisco Unified Communications. This is it. This is where we start. So before we just jump into the content though, I want to take a moment to go over all of these icons in detail because that's what we're going to be using throughout this entire series. So first of all, you guys should know these two, right? Our lovely Ethernet switch and router. Got those down good. This thing is a voice-enabled router. It's got the V on it. Notice the V here. And that basically means it has a voice feature set. Now, there's several different voice feature sets that a router could have. So you might see it used in a couple different scenarios, which is why I will have this labeled, okay, depending on which one we're using. Also, this router is also a router, and it has, as you can see, the phone there. That means that this router is running CME. We'll talk about what that is, or UCME, actually. And it's also got the envelope, which means that it's also running Unity Connection. And if you don't know what those things are, that's no problem. We're going to be talking about all those things, but I'm just pointing that out. The second thing is I'm using this icon is my voice application server. So what that means is I may be using it for Call Manager. I may be using it for Unity Connection. It just depends. That's the one I'm using. I'll have it labeled to which one is which. If I don't, I'll write it down. But that's going to be a voice application server like Call Manager, Unified Communications Manager, or Unity Connection, or one of those servers. Anyway, this is our multi-layer switch. We should all know that one. Got an IP phone here. Definitely be seeing a lot of those, right? And then also we have a CUP-C client. Now, a CUP-C client, if you haven't heard of this yet, there's an application called Cisco Unified Personal Communicator. You actually have to have a Cisco Unified Presence server to run Cisco Unified Personal Communicator. Nowadays, with release 9 and later, it's called Cisco IM&P, Cisco Instant Messaging and Presence, because it was too confusing for a while calling Presence what it is, because Call Manager offers Presence, and then there's another server that's called Presence. So anyway, it's been relabeled to Cisco IM&P with version 9 and later. The old versions is Cisco Unified Presence Server and Cisco Unified Personal Communicator. All right, then we have, and by the way, you notice a little camera here. This guy did video, he did chat and instant messaging, and click to call. He was a soft phone. Could do a lot of different feature sets with that application, which we will be taking a look at. Then we have this fax client. This is not a fax over IP server or anything fancy. It's analog fax, okay? And we also have our analog phone, which is extremely important about learning voice, right? We gotta be able to take into account all of these things. And then we've got our cloud. So that's pretty much the icons. And by the way, these are the same ones you'll see in a lot of topologies. They're the most common out there. They're the Cisco icons, right? So anyway, let's dive into what is unified communications. What is this whole unified communications thing really all about? Well, before the late 90s, okay, there was a clear separation of voice and data networks. For example, I go into my phone closet. That's what they called it, right? My phone closet. And I would see a switch up on the wall. Typically, these are, anywhere depending on the size of deployment. It may be a small switch, about yay size, and it's not an Ethernet switch, right? This was a phone switch. So it had a lot of analog or digital lines coming between the two, and they cascaded these things to grow huge. There was phone switches I've seen that take up buildings in size of this, rooms this big, literally, that supported like, 20,000 phones, things like that. Huge building, or huge room anyway, huge switch. And nowadays we could do that like on a couple servers. So pretty cool stuff. But anyway, it was big. And then we also had applications that these guys would run. So in the later phone systems, you would have servers that would integrate with them. And they would usually integrate with a PRI tie line or a T1 tie line, something like that. And they used, TDM signaling, which we'll talk about. But here's the thing. They also had these end stations that were on everybody's desk, right? Which was a phone. That's an end station. So you had to have the cabling that went through the walls that took you back to that phone closet. And then, you had everybody's phone, and then there was that central switch that's back in the closet, along with a voicemail application server, possibly, maybe some IVR for contact center stuff, and then you had that which would be connected to the PSTN switch, and you would have interfaces. You would have PSTN interfaces. So maybe you had analog, right? Or maybe digital. And a digital PSTN interface would be a PRI, right? That's ISDN. That's one phone closet. And then you went to the data closet, which was, a lot of times right next door. In smaller environments, it could have been the same room, right? But anyway, you would have a data switch, and usually lots of them, right? They would cascade as well. And then you had this cabling that would come out to everybody's end station. And so again, you had two different cables that were coming to each station, and two different types of wiring, because this analog used like RJ11s, and the data used RJ45s, right? And so two different sets of cables, two different closets, two different types of equipment, but all following the same kind of blueprint. They all have endpoints. They all go back to a central switch. They all have a connection. With the T1, it goes out to the internet, though, and that uses the same types of connections. It uses a T1, and the PRI is based off that same concept of a T1, right? It's really the same card, same thing, okay? So a lot of similarities between the two, but even though they're similar, they were still two separate networks. So what unified communications really began with is this: bringing it all together, okay? Unifying that network so that there's one network to maintain. So if you look at it, we now still have our call agent, okay? We still have our application servers, except these are all, IP-based equipment. We still have our data switch, okay? That's not going anywhere. But now, instead of having that PSTN switch and that kind of thing, we use voice gateways. And they broker that world between the digital and or I should say between the IP world and the PSTN. So, and they also provide us access. They can also provide us access to our data needs. So we get a lot of things out of that unified architecture. Here's the other big thing. Now we've standardized on one type of cabling everywhere. So the cabling going to everybody's desktop, we use one type of cable, RJ45, or Cat5, sorry, the RJ45 is the connector. We use Cat5e or Cat6, right? Or we could use Cat5 in the early voice, but Cat5e, Cat6. And so that's one network to maintain now, right? For voice and video. So one unified architecture, and this was the blueprint. Of course, now we consider unified communications additional applications and additional features, and voice, video, and all these other features are considered part of unifying the data and the voice architecture. Here's the other thing. Since now this architecture is unified, I can closely integrate with one of the two. So I can have my phones communicate with data services like video, right? A video over IP or video solutions can be integrated. Also, instant messaging applications, click to call. There's a lot more application integration because now everything is an application versus this disparate system that was that I had no interaction with, right? So this is really the benefit. And by the way, single cable to the desk of a user, and then you just use there's a switch port in the back of the phone, so you can use another cable and extend that to your terminal. So it's just one cable to each phone now. So think of the just structural cost that has been reduced by 50% as much as, right? Just by using a unified architecture, using that same cable for voice and data, right? So anyway, this is really what unified communications is all about. Now, like I said, today's unified communications, we keep adding and adding and adding, and so it's grown, but that's really, that's the foundation. These are two of my favorite slides, though. So we started with two separate networks, right? It's like the tale of two networks, and then we ended up with a unified architecture, okay? All right, So what are some of the components of Cisco's UC components? And actually, this is kind of an old slide that I borrowed. It's not a slide, it was a image. But anyway, one of the only ones that I borrowed. We've got the unified IP phones. We've got also wireless phones, like the 7921, 7925. And by the way, the wireless phone thing, you may still have some wireless phones out there, but we also have this soft client that goes on our iPhone or Android that we could do phone calls from, and it's part of our data network. So we don't use minutes. Anyway, we'll talk about that too. We've got this 7985, that's actually end of life, so don't look at that too much. Our newer phones, like the 9971, those are video enabled. They really replaced that guy, right? We have our unified personal communicator, which is what I was talking about, that could do voice and video and messaging and calling. We have the IP communicator, which is a soft phone. And we'll be using that a lot in this class so you guys can see the different numbers being dialed and calls being answered, all that kind of good stuff. Then we also have this product called Video Advantage. Really what this was a Logitech camera that went on our computer, and it integrated with the soft phone capabilities, or if you had the software, it would connect to your desk phone. So if somebody else had that VT Advantage camera, you got video calling. It was not video conferencing. You couldn't put 4 or 5 parties in the same call. You had video calling. It was one-to-one, right? And then on top of this, we have our applications. And by the way, this is really replaced now with the Cup C or Jabber clients, which we'll get into. So we've got our applications, and these could be third-party or Cisco's got some, right? And then we've got the Unity Express messaging system. So that's a voicemail platform and a couple different variants of that, right? We also have Cisco Emergency Responder that is used for location awareness, things like 911 and making sure you have uniform 911 calls throughout the organization and location services on users. We also have Unified Contact Center solutions with CRS, or what's now called Cisco Contact Center Express and Contact Center. We have Unified Meeting Place, which has now been replaced. This is now WebEx. Okay, and then Unified Presences, which is just showing who's on the phone, who's not throughout the entire directory, which, by the way, we'll be talking a lot about that separately. It's kind of its own long conversation. For call control, we've got a couple different versions. We've got the Cisco Unified Communications Manager, which is full-blown call manager, okay? And then we have Call Manager Express, which is router-based call control. And this is what lives on iOS routers. And so it doesn't have to have a call manager to be used. And you know, voice routers, whenever they're voice gateways, have a sub-feature set of this call manager. But the thing that makes Call Manager Express, is you have phones registered directly to the router. Okay, so he's acting as the call agent. And then beyond that, you have the infrastructure, right? So the routing, switching, management, QoS, quality of service, that's a big one for voice, security and administration. So all of these things make up the components of the unified communications system, okay? And I just wanted to point this out early, but today's UC architecture has taken another twist. And so we've started doing the world of virtualization and software-defined networking. With that, Call Manager, the Unified Communications Manager, which for so many years was restricted to be used on Cisco MCS servers, their media control servers. Now it is still somewhat restricted, but it's virtualized. And by the way, these are those phones that replaced the 7985, and notice they have the little camera there on top. These are the 9971s. Anyway, so this is a new element because we have the data center layer that's now a part of unified architecture if you're using virtualization. So I am going to make it a point, even though this is not an official part of the program, to talk about this because this is what's happening today. Okay, this is what's going on today. So anyway, all the voice applications are virtualized, or you can have a virtualized option now, which has greatly expanded the availability of unified communications and also made it easier for you to have a home lab to practice this stuff, which I will talk about in another video. So now that we've had that overview, let's start looking at the details.